And at the end of that symposium, my friend pulled me aside and she's like, Jimmy, I love you. Um, I know that whatever I say, you're not going to be offended and that you can hear truth and you can put your emotions aside. But I'm telling you, run from that man. She said he is wildly dangerous. She said he's a narcissist. I'm telling you that he does not like you. He's going to find a way to somehow hurt you and manipulate you. And she's like, you don't want to be caught up with a man like that. She's like, I'm telling you, I saw evil when he was up there.
I am talking to Jimmy Hinton, who is one of the people who knew Jon Uhler, subject of reporting that we have been doing at the distance. Jimmy, thank you for talking to us.
Absolutely.
Jimmy, our audience is not going to know who you are, so if you could just tell us briefly about yourself, so we know your background.
Sure. So I'm a full-time pastor. I've been since 2009, and I'm at my home congregation in Pennsylvania. It's the church I grew up in, and my dad preached at that church for 27 years. So I grew up at the feet of him and went into ministry because of him. And I had a very good relationship with my dad. And 2 years into my ministry in 2011, my youngest sister disclosed to me that she had been sexually abused by him whenever she was a minor. I reported that to the police immediately. Both my mother and I reported it. And very quickly after that, when he was pulled in for questioning, he had confessed to victims, um, all sexual abuse, all children between the ages of 3 and 11. And of course, that was a huge shock to the system. And so I started blogging pretty much immediately after he was arrested. In June of 2012, my dad was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. So he will be 91 years old when he's first eligible for parole. So he will die in prison. Um, and so I began blogging pretty much immediately after he was arrested in 2011. And of course, that caught the attention of other advocates. And I didn't know at the time that it was so unusual for church leaders to report abuse. And it really caught the attention of people because not only was there abuse in the church that was reported immediately, and then we took immediate action to prevent that kind of abuse from happening again. But people were shocked that I reported my own father. And for me, it just, it wasn't even a question. It was just the right thing to do. And so that kind of launched my work into the advocacy arena. And I began blogging, uh, speaking, doing trainings all over the country. And then a few years ago, I published my first memoir. But I'm also preaching full time still.
How did you get introduced to Jon Uhler, and what was the story of your interaction with him?
In 2014, I had done a local training for it was a free local training at our hosted at my church, and that was for anybody who wanted to learn more about the dynamics of abusers, how they think, how they operate. And I had been maintaining contact with my dad ever since he went to jail. So, I had been visiting when he was in the county jail. Then when he went to prison a year later, uh, we had written letters back and forth pretty much weekly. And I had a good insight for how somebody like him thinks and manipulates. And, even from prison, it was pretty crystal clear that, there was no remorse. And all he wanted were pictures of his victims. He was writing letters to his victims from prison, which I don't know how that got past the prison security, but he was writing to minor victims that he actually was charged on. And so the prison put a quick stop to that. But I had done this local training just trying to inform people about the dynamics of abusers and what to look for and how we had all missed it, and then steps that churches can take to report abuse whenever there are allegations, and how to walk a church through the aftermath of abuse. And so present at that training was another pastor from a local church, and that was Jon Uhler's pastor. And so he approached me after the workshop, and he said, "I have this man who I want to introduce you to. He actually works in prison with sex offenders, and is really well versed on how they think, and he talks about it a lot." And so we had went out for coffee, and that's when I first met Jon Uhler. And I mean, immediately, um, he just knew all the right things to say, and was introduced himself as a therapist and an expert working with sex offenders. And he kept talking about how he just was so amazed that I was still able to stand on my own feet, and to be in the shape that I was in. And he was really impressed. And as I was talking, and I wasn't really revealing a lot of details about my own father, but he kept saying, I'm experiencing vicarious trauma, and I just can't imagine that you're so strong and you're able to do this. And he started talking about this idea of a partnership with him. I mean, so right out of the gate, um, he was talking about partnering. And of course, in advocacy work, it's extremely lonely. And, it's not a glamorous position. And, talk to any advocate, and they'll tell you there are a million different things that we'd rather be doing in life. But we do it because there's a deep sense of obligation. And once somebody's experienced that level of pain, um, we want to prevent other people from having to go through it. And so Jon was very flattering, and he talked about setting up a meeting at my house where he would come over and talk about a business proposal. Um, and so we set that up, and he had this idea for a nonprofit organization. And he said, we'll call it Church Protect. And he was there for probably an hour. And before he left, he's like, you know what? I'm going to file the paperwork for it. And, I'm going to launch this nonprofit organization because you just have so much to offer. And I feel like the two of us together would be a really powerful team. And, he walked out of my house, and I had felt like I didn't really have a choice. But at the same time, I was, I was kind of excited about the opportunity of partnering with somebody because I'd been doing this solo since 2011. And, the things he had presented was about having retreats, and, we would reach out to victims, we would do trainings, but then we would have kind of the power and name brand, so to speak, behind a nonprofit organization. And so there's a lot more authenticity to it. So, um, So he walked out of the house and said he was going to file this nonprofit organization, and that he had filed them before, so he knew the structure of the paperwork and how to file it and all that. And my wife was not happy. Um, she said, "He didn't even ask you." She's like, "He reminds me of your dad. Not because of the sexual abuse, but in the way that he manipulates people and doesn't give people a choice." Um, and I was actually a little bit offended whenever she said that because I was defending him. And I was like, he dedicated his whole life to working with sex offenders. And that's not an easy thing to do. And so I'm doing this whole spiel about how he's a really good guy and his pastor vouched for him um and so I don't want to say that I did it anyway because I think he was going to file that regardless. Um, but I was kind of along for the ride. And looking back, I was like, man, who in their right mind would force somebody into a partnership? And I don't mean like being coerced, but manipulated into it, where there's one hour meeting, and then somebody walks out the door and says, "Okay, I'm going to file the paperwork. We're going to start this." So there was not really time for me to think about it, and I think looking back, that was by design. Um, so it was not much longer that it was filed, and I think it was sometime around the beginning of 2015. Church Protect was filed with the state of Pennsylvania. It was filed as a nonprofit organization, and we kept having pretty much weekly meetings. And he would come over to the church building where I worked, and was all about his charts and showing me what an expert he is, and showing me that he's been studying sex offenders and he's been researching them forever. And he just made it sound like he was the top expert in the nation. And he talked about how he had worked with over 3,000 sex offenders. And we learned since then that number's grown to over 4,000 now, which just mathematically none of that works. But I never looked into it. And after I parted ways with him, I just sat down and thought, I was like, those numbers are so stinking inflated that they're just flat out lies. And so the two prisons that he worked at in Pennsylvania, Crescent SCI and Somerset SCI, the whole population of both of those prisons doesn't even add up to 4,000. So when they were at max capacity, we're talking every single inmate, every bed filled, doesn't add up to 4,000. So I was like, how in the world was he able to work with 4,000 sex offenders when sex offenders only make up, something like 15 to 20% of the prison population is made up of sex offenders. And that's all sex offenders. That's not just pedophiles. I mean, that's all sex offenses. So, the math just didn't add up. And the more I got to know him, the more I realized he was just really, really full of himself. And he loved talking about himself when he would introduce himself. Whenever we would host workshops through Church Protect locally, he would introduce himself, for 10 minutes. He would talk about all of his experience. And basically, it was like this overinflated resume. And for me, I don't know. It just doesn't matter. Like, I don't like when people call me pastor. I don't like, like, I just don't like titles. And people ask me what my degree is. And, I get uncomfortable because I just don't care. Like, it doesn't matter, Like, I didn't go into ministry to flaunt my degrees. But for him, it was all about establishing his authority. And throughout that couple year period, so I resigned in October of 2017. So a little over 2 years, we had that partnership. And in that time, every single one of our donors, we had monthly donors, they all came through me. And I started to realize in 2017, I was like, man, he just doesn't have any connections at all. And he talks about all of his experience and his expertise, and every now and then would talk about his family, but he didn't talk much about his family. And I found that to be a little bit odd, that it was just all about him and all about his work experience and what an expert he was. Um, so I don't know. There were just some things that were adding up that I was like, man, he's not doing anything to further this organization, but yet he's talking about these grandiose ideas. He wanted to start a retreat center. And I mean, he obsessed about that idea. And he wanted to have it for uh, female survivors. And it was going to be kind of like an in-house, um, like a center. And we had a camp property that came up for sale for over $1 million locally. And he showed that to me and he was like, "Man, this camp is for sale. Do you think that we'd be able to get donors and be able to purchase a property?" And in my mind, I'm like, "What are you nuts?" Like, it just doesn't work that way. And to be able to have that much purchase power, it was an impossibility for us. And I wasn't really attracted to the idea anyway because the amount of expertise and the amount of staff that you would have to have for a place like that, um, I'm just not equipped for it. And he wasn't either. I mean, he was way out of his league. But it got to the point where he had met with my own mom and went out to her property, and she has a pretty big property, and it's the house that we grew up in. And it's a big house. She lives there all alone, so it's just a massive house for one person. She has 23 acres of property. No neighbors. I mean, it's up in the woods. It's, pretty secluded. And he had set up an appointment with my mom, and I didn't even know about this until after the fact. My mom called me that night, and she was livid. And she's like, "He came out to my house. He wanted to meet with me, and I didn't know what he wanted to meet about." And she said, before he left the house, he had already had my house donated to him, in his own mind. He had this idea and he had papers that he showed and, all these sketches of this retreat center. And he said, "You know what? We could turn your basement into separate rooms. We could build it out and we could use this as a facility." And, he just was such a fast talker. And she called me up, and this was also shortly before I resigned. And she said, "You need to run from that man." She said, "He is so manipulative and he's a user." And she's like, "His reputation is going to go up in flames eventually." And she said, "You're going to be drugged down with him." And so that was kind of the beginning of the end when I started seeing things that um, they just didn't add up. And uh, like I could name all kinds of things, and it's not like there was one big huge aha moment, but it was little subtle things. Like I had done all the content for our Facebook page, and I was writing posts, and I was pretty active on social media. And he had done a couple posts, like a handful of posts eventually, towards 2017, before I resigned. And one day I log onto our Facebook account and literally every single one of my posts had been deleted. And so I called him up and I was like, "Hey, um, I noticed that all my posts are gone." And he played dumb. He was like, "Oh, really?" I'm like, "Yeah, really. Like literally 100% of them. Every single post that I've ever written is deleted." And he said, "Oh, I was on Facebook and I was on our account and I was just kind of cleaning it up and I must have inadvertently deleted your posts." And I'm like, "You're such a snake." At that point, I was like, He's just such a liar." It's a lie. Why not just admit that you deleted my post? But he made it sound like it was this accidental thing, and I just inadvertently deleted them. Um, and one of the things that he had done too is we only did one training together under the brand of Church Protect. And that was in another state. That was out in Ohio. And we traveled together and everything went well. Um, I don't really think there was anything that I would consider that a bad experience. But we started getting requests for bookings. And I would ask him, "Do you want to take this or do you want me to take this one?" And every single time he would say, I'm working full time at the prison. I already have income. You have a family to support. Why don't you take this one?" And so we talked about pay, and he was like, "Well, you're the one doing it. So, when they pay us, maybe a portion can go to the organization, and then you take the rest." And so we had kind of settled on a speaking fee that regardless of who did it, that person would get that fee. And he had all his charts and, different stuff that he had shared in the Google Drive, and then I had my material that was shared in Church Protect's Google Drive. And he had told me repeatedly, he's like, this is our content. And he's like, I don't consider it mine. It's our content. If you want to use anything of mine, go ahead, feel free. And if you're okay with it, I could use your material. I was like, yeah, I don't care. Like people ask me all the time for my material. I don't copyright my material. Um, because I just don't, I don't care. Like if people want to use it, fine. And I put a lot of my material on my website. I put it in my blogs. I don't really care. Like people ask me all the time, can I use this in a training? And 9.5 times out of 10, my response is knock yourself out. So, um, in the summer of 2017, he had sent me this big long email saying that he had stumbled across one of my training videos and he was astounded that I didn't give him credit. And it was this big long lecture. Like, I mean, he was angry. And he said, I'm not upset about this, but I just expected you to be a person of integrity. And um, basically it was like daddy talking to me and he was disappointed in me and I needed to repent of that. And so I thanked him and I was like, just so we're clear, it was only one presentation out of it was like 6 or 7 modules that I had done. And I said, I only used your material for that one. And I was like, you had told me um, that I could use your material. And I said, and I did give you credit. I said, I don't use people's material and not attribute credit to them. And so anyway, I after reading that email, I was like, man, this guy is so stinking full of himself. And it was in that same email that he had lectured me about a workshop that we had put on locally. And he told me that I made him look like a fool whenever I introduced him. He had said to me, you need to be careful how you introduce me because I'm the one with all the expertise. And he said, you really made it sound like you were the expert and I wasn't, which wasn't true at all. But, at that point, I just kind of stepped back and I was like, man, this guy is such a narcissist. And if he's that bent out of shape over people introducing him properly to make him look like an expert, I need to get away from him. Summer of 2016, I had been contacted by Patricia Euler. Trish Euler had sent me an email and she said, I need to meet with you. I need to tell you who Jon really is. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because by this point, there were a lot of things that made me really uncomfortable with him. And, I'd been manipulated and treated pretty poorly at certain points. But then he would come back and would be all kind and nice. And I was like, it's just very much gaslighting. So I agreed to meet with her. And she came to the church building, and I'd never talked to her before. I'd never met her in person before. And the very first thing she made me do was like physically unplug the phone at the church. She made me turn off my cell phone, and she said that people were listening in, and she felt like the place was bugged. And pretty much immediately, I was like, man, this is a woman who is not mentally well. Um, And so I went along with it. And it's not my first run in with people who are not well mentally. So, you kind of learn to play along with it to establish credibility with them and get them to talk. And she started going on and on about how I shouldn't be partnered with Jon. He's not a good guy. He's very deceptive. And it was more like a rant. And I was waiting for this aha moment, and it never really came. Like there was never anything specific that she said that he was doing, but she just said, "You need to run from him." And he is not a good person. He's not a good guy. He's not a good husband. He's not a good father. And I was kind of asking her for specifics because I was like, if I'm going to be partnered with this guy or I need to sever a partnership with him, I'd kind of like to have specific reasons. And it never came. And she would transition into conversations about how she's directly related to Noah, and she could prove it, and she could go back through genealogies in the Bible, and she could prove that she's a direct descendant of Noah. And I was like, man, this is getting weird. Um, so that conversation went on for probably 2 hours, and it was, I mean, almost solely her talking. So she ended up leaving, and it was a couple weeks later. Um, John calls me up and he's like, "You're not going to believe this." He's like, "My wife jumped from our second story balcony." And he said, "I found her in the yard, and she severed her spine, and she's going in for emergency surgery. And, she survived the fall." And he's like, "Something really weird happened when they were loading her up in the ambulance. She kept saying, 'Talk to Jimmy Hinton. He'll tell you who John is.'" And he said that she just kept repeating that. And then she took her wedding ring off and she threw it at him. And, you know, it was kind of, it really caught me off guard. And I was like, I know she talked to me in confidence, but this is a pretty big crisis. So I was like, I probably should tell him that she met with me a couple weeks ago. And so I made the mistake of telling him that. And I found out later on that he used that to taunt her. And he would send me emails where, after she recovered from the fall, she would email him and she was begging to get back together. And he would say things like, "What a psychopath. This is how a psychopath thinks." And he would forward her emails, which were, I mean, personal emails and whatever. Sometimes people do that, but it, I thought it was pretty inappropriate. And I was like, even if he hated her guts, and even if she hated his guts, like that's a time to work on things for the sake of the kids. They still had, if I remember right, they still had a couple minor kids living in the home. I think both Lane and Reed were still living at home. Uh, I believe both were still minors at the time. And I was like, man, it's not a time to taunt your your former wife. It's a time to kind of figure things out and pick a direction. And like if you want to confide in somebody and talk, fine. But if you're taunting that person and making fun of that person behind their back, like that's not really cool. So, at the same time, he was talking about this budding relationship with his former high school sweetheart. And I'm talking like within weeks of her taking that jump off of the balcony. He's talking about going out to California and, he said, I'd been out to visit my parents in California and I bumped into Susan, my former high school sweetheart. And, we rekindled our friendship. And so I'm going to be spending some time going out there. So I need you to kind of take care of things with Church Protect because I'm going to be spending a good bit of time out in California. And I was like, man, it's getting really bizarre. Um, and then, a few months went by. I mean, it wasn't long at all. I'm going to say maybe 3 or 4 months. Um, and then I think it was a phone call, but he told me that he was going to marry her. And he said, we're not really married anyway, me and Trisha, because she threw her wedding ring at me. And so we're technically not married. So he wanted to marry Susan. And he said, matter of fact, which is that's a common expression of his when he's manipulating you. He'll say, matter of fact, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to perform the wedding. And I was really uncomfortable with that. And I didn't express that to him, but in my mind, I was like, I'm going to find an excuse to not do that wedding because it's not right. And the circumstances behind it are bizarre. His family was literally falling apart back home. I was talking to some friends of the family, and they were talking about how the kids were not in good shape. Their mom had just jumped. She moved back to Canada. It was just a highly dysfunctional family, and the kids were not faring well at all. And he's talking about his budding romance, and never mentioning his kids, except to talk about how abusive his family was in California. Like he was flying his kids back and forth across the country, staying with his parents, and then there would be some big blow up, and then he would fly them back to Pennsylvania. And this was going on. Like he was bouncing those kids coast to coast. And I was like, it's just so bizarre. Like you got to stop and just be a parent. Um, be a parent to your kids and stop bouncing them around and giving them that instability. And at one point, he had asked me if I could take his boys in. He's like, they're just the home is unstable and they need a place to stay. And do you think that they could stay with you? And I was like, absolutely not. Like that's just not. That's not okay. It's not possible. I have a family of my own. My kids are still young. I'm not taking in your kids. Like you need to take care of your kids. So, it's those kinds of things. Like as a parent, I look at that and I'm like, you're counseling people to get their families right. Like it's your job as a therapist to help families that are dysfunctional to find some semblance of unity and reconciliation and to work through problems. And you're just pawning your problems, like you're creating problems, and then you're pawning the problems off on other people. And I found out that he had asked other people if they would take his kids in. I wasn't the only one. And I'm thinking, what parent does that? Especially in the middle of some big tragedy, like a pretty traumatic event when their mom falls off the balcony or jumps off or whatever happened. Nobody really knows what really happened. Um, but the story is that she had jumped off of the balcony and attempted suicide and was unsuccessful, which, may be the case. I don't know. Um, but John told me too that when that happened, he had a detective show up at the house because Trisha accused him of having a sex dungeon in the basement, and he was torturing her. And so a detective showed up, and he laughed about it. And he's like, "I said, hey, you want to come see my basement?" He said he let the detective in and showed him his quote unquote sex dungeon that was in his basement. And he said the detective looked at him and shook his hand and said, "Mr. Euler, have a nice day." And John said it's because there was no sex dungeon. And he's like, so she's just a liar. She's a manipulator, which again may or may not be true. I didn't know Trisha from a stranger on the street. Um, I just knew that she was not mentally well. From my one experience that I had with her, she was not mentally well. And again, as the spouse of somebody who's not mentally well, if you're a therapist, the first thing you do is you get your wife help. You don't call her a psychopath. You don't call her, a Wiccan. He would call her a witch. Uh, you get that person help, and you link them to a psychiatrist who can properly diagnose them. And if she needed medicated, she should be on medication. But that was never on his radar. It was just, I got to get away from this witch. She's into witchcraft. She's into all kinds of evil things, and I need to get away from her. But in the meantime, he was leaving the kids at the house. He had moved to Somerset and got a little small apartment, in between bouncing back and forth between California. His other home was an apartment in Somerset. And I'm just this is just nuts. Like this is a highly dysfunctional family in every definition of that word. And so, I was seeing him publicly both talk about and write about what a wonderful relationship he had with his kids. He would post letters that he had written to his kids and his kids wrote to him. He had emailed me letters that He had written to his boys that were like these impassioned letters about how proud he was of them and, like going out of his way to show me what a good father he is. And I'm like, man, if you have to explain yourself, if you have to show people how good of a father you are, you're probably not that good of a father. Like, why do you showcase how wonderful you are? Um, if you're really a wonderful father, just be one. And you don't have to explain it to people. You don't have to tell people what a great father you are. So there was just a lot of instability within the home. There was a lot of instability between our relationship. In 2017, he had started to kind of unravel. We hosted that last workshop that I talked about where, I didn't properly introduce him, and he had hired a professional videographer without telling me. And he used our credit card, Church Protects credit card. And it was I don't remember the exact amount, but it was somewhere around $3,000, which was pretty much all we had in the account. We were not pulling in big money at all. We had a couple small donors, but I would say the maximum we had in Church Protect's bank account at any given time was $5,000. And that's probably being liberal. So we never had much money, but then he hired this professional videographer crew and never ran it by me. And which, he didn't need my permission, but as a business partner, it's something you would probably should talk about when you make a big purchase like that. And he was talking about how this was going to get us notoriety and having it professionally videoed was going to give us resources and that was going to land us on the map. And it was all about image perception. And I felt like most of the time he was more of a politician than he was somebody who was actively engaged in ministry. Um, which is interesting because I found out later on that his entire family are all in politics, like big time on the Euler side. We got through that symposium. Trisha had moved back to Canada, and by this point, our relationship was pretty strained. And I was just kind of biding my time at that point. And then in October of 2017, I was invited to speak at my alma mater for their annual lectureships. And I took my wife with me. We left the kids with their grandparents, and I took my wife with me, and we kind of used that as a mini getaway vacation. And I told John that I was going to be off the internet. I said I'm not going to be answering emails. My phone is going to be shut off. I am completely unplugging from everything. I was like, I'm burned out. I need a break. I need a rest. And he reassured me and said, "Oh, okay, no problem. I'll take care of everything on my end." And we were only gone for 3 days. That was down in Arkansas. When I returned, I turned my phone on, and I'm telling you, there were dozens of emails. I had emails from reporters asking me what my stance was on Jon Uhler, and I was like, "What in the crap is going on?" Like I had no clue. I was oblivious. I'm like, "What did he do?" I had people demanding my resignation or demanding that I fire him. They were talking about what is my statement on Church Protect stance on abusing victims of abuse. And I was like, what in the world? So I get on Facebook and I found that there was a story about it was called the Jane Doe story from the Masters University out in California, uh, which is John MacArthur's university. And this woman had shared her story about how she was sexually abused. She reported it, and um, I forget the story exactly, but basically they had done nothing about it, and they didn't report it to authorities. And I think eventually they kicked her out or did some kind of disciplinary action against her while they kept her abuser at the university. Well, Jon Uhler is a huge fan of John MacArthur. I mean, huge fan. And he started writing about how, well, anybody who hides behind anonymity isn't really a victim. And I was like, wait, what? I mean, this is like advocacy 101, that it takes so long for victims to actually come forward. And I'd experienced it with my own sister. She was 20 years old when she finally came forward. And, oftentimes victims want to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation, because of shame, embarrassment. I mean, a whole host of reasons. And so it's not uncommon for survivors of abuse to come forward and to do that anonymously. And he was just adamant about this. And he said, basically, she wants attention, and no real victim would actually accuse somebody of doing this without putting their name forward. And that just lit up the advocacy community. There were survivors of abuse coming forward and reprimanding him and saying, like, what kind of a therapist are you? And then he began gaslighting them. Like, I'm reading these posts, and it was absolutely mortifying what he was saying to these survivors of abuse. Like, he was implying that they were visiting his Facebook page because they were lonely women at home who wanted to have an affair on their husband. And so he would say things like, "Well, since you keep visiting my page, let me recommend a resource that might help you out." And then he would link an article to how to help a cheating spouse. And I'm like, this is insanity. I mean, there were dozens and dozens of these posts. And so I called him up and I was like, what in the world were you thinking? And he thought it was funny. He's like, oh, I did it on my own personal Facebook page. So I was very careful to not put Church Protect's name behind what I was saying. I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, we're supposed to be this legitimate organization. We're supposed to have compassion for victims of abuse. Like just decent humanity, as a decent human being, you should have compassion on people who have the courage to speak out and have the courage to disclose their abuse. And you were mocking them. You were making fun of people. You were gaslighting. You were calling these women cheaters on their husbands. You were name calling people. You were berating people. And he just laughed it off. He thought it was actually funny. And so that was the point where I was like, it's not even a question. Like, I'm resigning immediately. I need to get away from this man. He's toxic. He's abusive. He's gaslighting victims of abuse. I had had several people at that point come to me and complain about him in private. All women who said that privately he had sent them emails, and one of them was one of my church members, and she said, "You tell that man to never contact me again." She said, "I don't ever want anything to do with that man." And so at that point, there was just enough that I was like, he's full of himself, he's narcissistic, he's dangerous, he's abusive, he's dysfunctional, he has a dysfunctional family, he lies, he manipulates, and I don't want anything to do with him. And so I talked to my wife for probably less than 3 minutes. And I said, I'm thinking of resigning from Church Protect. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going to do it. What are your thoughts? Her response was, finally. She said, you never should have partnered with him in the first place. So my mind was made up, and I wrote a letter of resignation. And I knew that he was going to find some way to retaliate, because by that point, I just saw, he's an angry person. And if you do anything that makes him look bad, um, or at least has the perception of him looking bad, it does not make him a happy person. And so I feared retaliation, and I was like, well, I can't specifically name what he was doing. And, at this point, like, I just want to cut ties with him. So I wrote a letter of resignation that said something to the effect of, due to pretty radical differences um, in the direction that we're going, um, I I resigned from Church Protect effective immediately. And I put it on social media. I'd contacted him first, told him I was going to resign. And, at first he was like, okay, fine. Thank you for serving. It was like really generic. But when I posted on social media, he absolutely went nuts. He had called me and I didn't answer the phone. And he left two different voicemails and he was just screaming in a phone. I mean, he was livid and he was cursing and screaming. And he said, how dare you do this? He said, you made me look like an idiot. He said, you need to rephrase that or there are going to be consequences. And then he said, um, I'll tell you what, if you don't rephrase your resignation letter, he said, I have all kinds of emails that you've sent and I will publish them. And I just responded back, publish what you will. I stand by what I said and I'm not changing it. And so the next day, he had emailed and, I figured he probably had a little bit of time to cool off, but he had emailed me and he said, you need to make your resignation official as a board member of Church Protect. Um, the board has to vote on this. Well, the board consisted of me and him. So he's like, the board has to vote on the decision for you to resign. We have to approve it. I was like, okay, fine. What do you need? And he said, you have to write a formal letter of resignation and sign it and put it on a church protect letterhead. I said, okay, fine. So I write a letter. I put it on a letterhead, and he had um uh when he had registered Church Protect, he did it at my residential address. And so the letterhead had my home address on it. And I wrote this letter and immediately he published it on Facebook and wrote this really gushy post about how wonderful it was to serve with me and what an honor and a privilege. Um, and then he said, I'm really proud that you're going on to do more work, and I pray that your work and advocacy continues. And he posted my resignation letter with my home address. And so I started getting calls from people locally, and they were like, dude, he just doxed you. I was like, what are you talking about? So I went and I looked at the post and I was like, son of a gun. I was like, I fell for it, Like the only reason he wanted that letter, I'm convinced now, the only reason he wanted that was to make himself look good and to dox me because I think in his own mind, people thought that I was going to be like, this idiot who resigned from this highly credentialed nonprofit organization, which wasn't the case at all. In the end, like I got several emails from people, private emails from people who had volunteered with Church Protect. Again, all women who John recruited, and they all thanked me. And they said, we're so thankful that you got away from that man. So, it just kind of validated that it was time. It was time to get away from him. And it was not a good relationship.
You had told me a story about a licensed therapist that you knew who showed up to that workshop in 2017 and told you something afterwards. Are you able to tell that story?
I am. I won't mention her name because I just don't have her permission, but she was a licensed therapist in another state, and I think a very good therapist. And she's very intuitive, and she can read people pretty easily. But she had traveled up to come to that symposium, that workshop in 2017, and John, that was another thing that he did. He invited all these people to a dinner the night before we spoke. And he also had gotten guest speakers to speak. And I was like, how are you going to pay them? And he's like, well, what do you think we ought to pay them? He's like, what kind of an honorarium do you think we ought to give them? I was like, I don't know, but you can't expect people to come up for free at their expense. And some of these people are coming from out of state. Um, like one whole family, if I remember right, they actually flew in. And I'm like, who's going to fund that? Like, who's paying for that? We don't have the money to do it. you hired this videographer and we just don't have the money. And he was like, oh, don't worry about it. He's like, God is blessing this ministry, and the Lord led me to, that was another one of his expressions. The Lord led me to have this dinner. And, we need to build rapport with people. And so he did a reservation at a restaurant, and, the company footed the bill. And my friend the therapist friend was at that dinner. And he's like, Jimmy, why don't you introduce yourself for those who don't know you? So I get up and, I did basically an introduction, probably shorter than what I did here for the podcast. And he says, okay, I'm going to introduce myself now. And I mean, I'm telling you, he went on for, it was 10 to 15 minutes about all of his experience. And, he had counseled over 3,000 sex offenders and started naming all of his degrees and all of his experiences and, the businesses that he had and the halfway houses that he did, or treatment facility centers that he started. And he's just going on and on. And then he did the same thing at the symposium. And at the end of that symposium, my friend pulled me aside and she's like, Jimmy, I love you. Um, I know that whatever I say, you're not going to be offended, and that you can hear truth and you can put your emotions aside. But I'm telling you, run from that man. She said he is wildly dangerous. She said he's a narcissist. I'm telling you that he does not like you. He's going to find a way to somehow hurt you and manipulate you. And she's like, you don't want to be caught up with a man like that. She's like, I'm telling you, I saw evil when he was up there. I was like, well, okay. And that was literally like maybe I'm going to say 2 days before he sent me that email where he reprimanded me for not introducing him properly. And I was like, all right, she's onto something, you know? So it's just everything was adding up to having to get away from him. And that he just was very verbally abusive, was a master at gaslighting people. And I just didn't want anything to do with him anymore. John started asking me for all of the files, which I had. I had all the financial stuff, all of that stuff. We had done Patreon accounts where we had subscribers, monthly subscribers to that, the donations, all of that. So I had file folders with basically all the paperwork except for the filing paperwork, because he was the one who filed it. So he had sent me emails and asked me for those records, which I was happy to hand over. I had no business having them anyway. I literally wanted nothing to do with that organization anymore. This is probably within hours or maybe a day or two. He had sent me an email with a letter from the IRS, and it was saying that you didn't file your I forget the name of the short form, because I've never had a nonprofit before, so I didn't know that every year you have to file the short form for your financials. And we had a hired accountant. So the reason we had a hired accountant is because I don't do accounting. And John said he doesn't do accounting either. So I think it was just something that was overlooked by the accountant, which isn't a big deal. Basically, the IRS sends you a letter and it says you have 60 days to file this or something like that. I forget the time period, but I think it's 60 days. And if you don't file this, um, we revoke your tax exempt status, and then we'll reinstate it once you file this short form. So it's honestly, like, I looked it up and it's literally not a big deal. Nonprofits do it all the time. It gets overlooked all the time. There's no penalty for it. There's no fine for it. It's just that the IRS wants you to file that to show that you're still a nonprofit that's in good standing, that you have actual financials. So he wanted me to gather everything up, and he started accusing me of hiding financials from the organization. And I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? So he sent me these condescending emails, and he said, you're responsible and liable for damages incurred to Church Protect's reputation. And he's like, you need to get this taken care of immediately. Um, or else there are going to be repercussions for that. And I took that to be that he was going to, like the implication was he was going to sue me. So, of course, not having a whole lot of money on hand to hire attorneys, um, I was a little bit panicked at first because I was like, holy crap, what if this is a big deal? And I kept looking it up and I was like, it really is not a big deal. I went on the IRS's website and it lays out like what you do if you miss the deadlines, and they say right on the website like this is not a big deal. You'll temporarily lose um, your status as tax exempt, but then we reinstate that as soon as you file this form. So I got all the paperwork together and I brought it into the attorney. It was like this huge stack of receipts, like everything from the very beginning, from whenever we first started. So I brought it into the accountant and I was like, look, there's this deadline and he wants this filed. Can you guys do that? They were like, yep, no problem. So that deadline came and went and it never got filed, which I didn't know. I just assumed that they had filed. And he sent me another email and he was like, I knew that you were trying to skim money off of the organization. And it was like all these accusations. And he's like, you had a fiduciary duty as the vice president to keep track of records. And, like he was going on and on and on, just trying to intimidate me. And so I contacted the accountant and they were like, look, it's our tax season. Like we're in the middle of a busy season right now. We will get it done. I was like, okay. And they reassured me and they did. Like it really was not a big deal. But it was just the fact that he was accusing me um of skimming money, of ripping the company off, of padding my own pockets. That really bothered me. And then I was like, you know what? Like this is just who he is. Um, he loves pointing fingers at people. He loves intimidating people. He loves scaring people. And that just confirmed that it was the right decision to get away from him. But he did the same thing with it was Church Protect's website. So it was churchprotect.org. Um, I had hosted that, like kind of paired it with my own domain name, which is perfectly fine to do. You can do that for nonprofits. Um, it saves you money. It saves you like, whatever, $100 a year. So I had paired it with mine on my host, and then I unpaired it because he was so adamant. He said, you need to hand that website over to me immediately, which he had all the passwords. He was able to log in, like literally nothing changed. And we were just trying to assign up to him. And it's a little bit of a process. It takes up to a week to actually make the full transfer. But in the meantime, he's sending me screenshots where his new wife, Susan, was taking pictures of my website and it would link back to Church Protect. And so I got on and I was like, oh, geez. I was like, if that's the case, like, I need to fix that because this guy's going to be a constant thorn in my side. So I went and I checked and it wasn't true. Like, Church Protect was fully his. He changed the passwords. I did not have access to it. And the ownership was in the process of being transferred to him. And it takes up to a week for this transfer to take place. Um, but I don't have access to this website. I don't have it linked to my own personal website. Like I have nothing to do with this website. And he just kept sending me email after email. He probably sent me a dozen emails where he was accusing me of stealing his intellectual property and there were going to be consequences if I didn't hand that over. And why was I holding his website hostage? And I'm like, he's just a lunatic. Like he's not right in the head. It's finally the conclusion I came to. Like, not only is he abusive, he's verbally abusive, he's manipulative, he's a liar, um, but he's nuts. Like, in his own world, he's probably convinced that all these people are out to get him. And, I happen to be one of those people that I think he thought in his own mind I was out to get him and I was out to rip him off. And just, it wasn't true. So I was glad to shake the dust off my feet and run from both him and the organization.
this whole time, John had been breadcrumbing and sending you emails where he's taunting Patricia and so on. Which is kind of amazing that he's doing that at the same time he's trying to, have you be this business partner to him. I don't know. What do you think was going on in his mind? Do you suppose that John was trying to draw you into his intrigue, to give you some sense of responsibility for it so that you would take part? What do you think his game plan was by sharing with you so much of what he was doing and what he was really about?
I really don't know. And that's something I've talked to about. I've talked about that with other people because we were like, what does he have to gain by the things that he's doing, the things that he's saying? Like, what is his end game? It just doesn't make sense. And I think, I mean, this is speculation, but I think probably he's so intent on convincing people that he's the top expert that that was his way of like showing notes, so to speak. Like, obviously his ex-wife was not a patient of his, but he's done that before, and he's done that on X, he's done it on Facebook where he shows literal notes of his clients, which blows my mind. And I think that's what it was. I think he just has a lot to prove. I think it's him trying to work overtime to prove that he can diagnose people, that he can, only he can figure people out. Because he said in the emails when he would forward them, he's like, see, this is how the mind of a psychopath thinks. And in my mind, I'm like, no, that's the mind of somebody who's not well mentally. That's somebody who needs help. That's somebody who needs therapy. That's somebody who um, has all kinds of issues that they need to work through, not somebody who's a psychopath. So I think that's the heart of the issue. I think he has a lot to prove. And I still see he has me blocked from his social media, which, whatever. I just I'm okay with that. But I still see things that people post where, he's claiming to be the top expert, not only in the United States, but Canada too. I have more clinical hours than any prison psychologist in the United States and Canada. And I'm like, yeah, no, you don't. But it's those sorts of things, I think he's just trying to inflate himself, and his public persona really matters to him. But ironically, he blows it to smithereens by making himself not credible, and he doesn't even realize it. He doesn't even know it.
Jimmy Hinton, thank you so much for talking to us. It has been a pleasure. I hope that we might meet one day under different circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking truth and looking into truth. And it was my honor to be here today.